Thomas Foster writes of acts of communion in his novel How to Read Literature Like a Professor. These acts of communion are commonly thought of as eating together, but an act of communion can also be having sex, in a way that devours each other's bodies. We will discuss how Cormac McCarthy and Toni Morrison portray acts of communion in their novels The Road and Beloved. In The Road, the main characters, father and son, share intimate moments in a time of suffering when they eat together. The two characters are usually too preoccupied to talk when they are on their journey, but when they sit down to eat together, they are really able to communicate. This shows an act of communion between father and son. Another way the eating between father and son is an act of communion is because it shows great love of the son by the father. The father wants the son to be a light for this dark world, so he is always giving the son food to eat. It is a long, lonely journey along the road with just father and son. Soon, however, the father and son eventually come across an old man called Eli. First, the two give Eli some food, and he eats all of it. Then the father and Eli spark up a fire and sit together among it while the son sleeps. This sharing of each other's company can be seen as a bond formed in a time of suffering, which was all started by the act of sharing food with one another. This shows another act of communion between father and Eli. In The Road, Eli says, "It's better to be alone." But obviously it isn't, as shown by the act of communion between father and Eli by the fire. In Beloved, Setha is now living in 124. Paul D comes to 124 to visit Setha, and Setha invites Paul D in to share a meal. The meal, however, is interrupted by the overwhelming urge for sex. What started as a meal between man and woman, an act of communion, ended in a sexual act, which is another act of communion. In Beloved, acts of communion can also be twisted in meaning, particularly with acts of communion having to do with sex. In Beloved, there are two types of acts of communion: rape and bestiality. In Beloved, there is a lot of rape, as it was common among slaves and owners in the time period that the book was written. Schoolteacher's boys rape Setha while schoolteacher watches, and it is a clear twisting of an act that should be an act of communion between two people. Toni Morrison writes, "I am full, goddammit, of two boys with mossy teeth, one sucking on my breast and the other holding me down, their book-reading teacher watching and writing it up." Sex is an act of communion that should only be shared between a man and a woman who are married. Setha had this right taken away from her, and Hala had to watch. Another way Beloved twists an act of communion like sex into something that it shouldn't be is by a portrayal of bestiality. When the men had sex with cows on the Sweet Home property, they are showing a clear twisting of an act that should be an act of communion between man and woman. Toni Morrison writes on page 11, "All in their 20s, minus women, fucking cows, dreaming of rape, thrashing on pallets, rubbing their thighs and waiting for the new girl."